What's up? Welcome to another episode of Theological Sidebars. Good to see you guys. So today I'm going to kind of talk about something that came out of the message this past week. We're talking about elders, the authority of the elder. And, it's an interesting thing to think about because I don't know if in church we think about the authority that any pastor or elder has anymore. That's just out of sight, out of mind. One of the things that you look at the scriptures, right, and you see that, for instance, like I'll probably open up the text in just a second to show you. But one of the things that we talked about was the idea that that the elder has authority in the life of the church. And, I think sometimes we would say that, yeah, sure, he has authority. He's got to help keep the church running. But is there more to it than that? All right, so the passage that we looked at, and I would say is important to look at, is this, right? Paul says to Titus, "For many rebellious people, full of empty talk and deception, especially from the circumcision party, it's necessary to silence them. They're ruining entire households by teaching what they shouldn't in order to get money dishonestly." And then he does the quote by the Cretan, and then he goes back down to the Cretan poet goes, "This testimony is true. For this reason, rebuke them sharply, so that they may be sound in the faith and not pay attention to Jewish myths and the commands of people who reject the truth." So right before this, right, he had already set up in verse 9 that you need elders to come in to be able to teach, to be able to refute the doctrine of these false teachers. And the big implication in this passage, of course, is that, right, the elders are to have oversight of what happens in the family life of the church members. Okay, now notice that authority is not authority that they get to just kind of make up. It's not an authority that they just get to arbitrarily just choose and decide, hey, here's what I want to do, or I want to speak in. Like, this authority, by the way, is not the kind of I think the stereotypical, when people think of like the overbearing, authoritarian pastors, you think of like the old Footloose movie, right? And John Lithgow's character is like, has such control over, we're not dancing or anything like that. Like that's not the kind of stuff that we're talking about here. This is not an authority that is, seeping into and saying, like, you can't read these books or you can't go to these movies, or if you don't, I'm going to find, like, that's not what we're talking about here. But this authority is an authority that comes with the idea of what is happening in the life of the people, and really being concerned from that shepherding perspective, right? Look at verse 11. This is why there is this authority and what this authority is directed towards in the life of the church, too, in life of the membership. It's necessary to silence them. They're ruining entire households by teaching what they shouldn't in order to get money. So I think that's important to recognize, is that the elder needs to step in when this is affecting the faith of the household, when this is something that has to do with the faith of the household and the people that are going on. If something's happening and there's creating turmoil in their faith, they're walking away, then we need to deal with that. So I would say that's important for us to recognize. The elder should have authority. Now, this is something, like, I think is largely lost today. If you had an elder speak into your life and say, hey, you need to put that down. You got to stop messing with that. Don't go this way. Don't read, like when you have false teaching, like I've had to deal with this in the past, where you have people who that they're beginning to dabble with something else. They're beginning to go down a certain way, or they're beginning to, read something, or they're finding themselves sucked into a new kind of teaching. It's important for, I think, that authority first needs to be, let's teach on that. Let's make sure but at some point, you need to be able to say, you shouldn't have any business doing that. Don't do it. Be done with that. I think that authority also of, fighting false teaching is that false teaching is not necessarily even going to be Christian teaching, but it's the messages of the world that are sucking in. When I say Christian teaching, I'm talking about under the guise of being Christian, but it's going to be the messages that the world is spewing and that the church is gravitating towards. So it's important to stop that stuff as it comes through. And so I would say that it's important first and foremost, if you look at the passage, right, he is the teacher. He is look at verse 9 there. He is the primary teacher of the church. The elder is, and he is to be speaking about the church. Look at verse 9 there. He is to teach, encourage with sound teaching, refute those who contradict. So he needs to know what the messages are and be able to deal with those as it comes along. So that's important. But there are times where he needs to step in and say, no, don't do it. So that's authority as it comes to the faith, the false messages, and the teaching. I also think that, so as we talk about this, should elders have authority, right? Like, do we give them authority? And what should that look like in the life of the church? Because I think sometimes, that with the churches, people say, well, I've got who cares what this pastor says? He's just an old fuddy-duddy, or, he's a stick in the mud. And, I don't like you. If I don't like you, what do we say? We're moving on. I'll go to the new church. I don't like how they are. I don't like their leadership. I don't like what they have to say. I don't want them speaking. Who are they to speak into my life? And largely, in the American church, we just say, yeah, I'll go down to the next church. Who cares? And there is no sense of authority in a church. We've moved beyond, what Hebrews says, obey your leaders and submit to them, since they keep watch over your souls as those who will give an account, so that they can do this with joy and not with grief, for that would be unprofitable for you, right? So there is this sense in the scriptures that we are to give and submit to and obey the teachings of our elders, right? Submit when they're seeing something that is going on, and they are going to, as we see in verse 9 of Titus, right, chapter 1, verse 9, of like they're gonna either encourage or they're gonna refute. Like, there should be a sense of submission to that. And I would say that submission is not only to the teaching and the message, but also to the general leadership of the church. Right? If the elders are going to lead in a certain way, the implication was not, well, just listen when they teach on Sunday. But the implication is like, where are they leading us, and are we willing to submit? So that's the general sense, and I think the church needs to regain that. I think, largely speaking, Christians who sit in the pews should have a lot more respect for the pastor, for the elder. I mean, look at what that says, that they are the ones who keep watch over your souls, who will give an account. Peter says that as the fellow elder, he says that the flock that was entrusted to you, that the congregation has been entrusted to the pastor, to the elder, to the shepherd. So, that being said, I also want to speak in something I haven't had a chance to, which is this authority, though, is not limited. I mean, is not unlimited. It's limited. Obviously, some of that authority already we've discussed, right? Which is, it's an authority to speak in, to call you out of sin. It's to call you away from the false teaching that you have, things that relate to the faith, right? And I would say, when you go down this road, if we're really going to believe in the authority of the elder, we also just need to make sure that we recognize that there are some parameters that are put on this. So this is not a blanket statement that whatever your elder says, because we've seen that abuse. I mean, you probably know from maybe church background or other people that there are some places that if the pastor says something, if the elder says something, people will unquestionably just do it, even if it was sinful. And that's not the kind of authority that the Bible has in mind for the elder. I think what the Bible has in mind is that, generally speaking, the people are to trust their elders. They're not to push back and fight when they don't like certain things, unless there's a real issue, unless there's something really wrong. Then they need to, bring it up. Now, the Bible envisions that there might be this in the future, right? Notice even as Paul finishes up 1 Timothy, he says this: the elders who are good leaders are to be considered worthy of double honor, especially those who work hard at preaching and teaching. So you want to honor your elders as they lead, and especially the teachers, right? But then he says, goes on a little bit more. Notice what he says in verse 19: don't accept an accusation against an elder unless it's supported by 2 or 3 witnesses. Publicly rebuke those who sin, so that the rest will be afraid. Now, I think what Paul is doing here is this: is he imagines that people are going to want to bring up accusations. And because elders are leaders, it's their prime targets to be brought up with an accusation. And Paul says for the church, don't do that unless you have 2 or 3 witnesses. Now, Verse 20 is, if you have 2 or 3 witnesses that verify the fact that there is something that has really gone on that is wrong with this elder, then that needs to be brought up and it needs to be taken seriously. And I think that's what verse 20 is. Publicly rebuke those who sin, so that the rest will be afraid, right? Because in the context, notice what else he says. He says, I solemnly charge you before God and Jesus Christ and the elect angels to observe these things without prejudice, doing nothing out of favoritism. Don't be too quick to appoint anyone as an elder, and don't share in the sins of others. Keep yourself pure. So, and this is the context of elders. And so I think there might be time where you would have, an elder who hasn't been found in sin, and there needs to be dealt with in a public way, him being addressed. And so this is one of those instances. I don't think Paul is saying, well, he's in sin, but still honor and make sure that you just do everything that he says and obey. That's not so that authority is not unlimited. I guess the illustration we might want to say too is, and this is, I taught on this the other day as we were going through Baptist Faith and Message, is, in the 3 spheres that God gives authority, right? You have government, you have family, church. In all those areas, we're told to honor and to obey. But in all 3 of those areas, we also recognize, because of the sinful world that we live in, is that their authority is not absolute, right? That there are things that families can do and ask of the individual that the child is not required to do, even though it is honor your father and mother. If the family is in sin and asking for something to be in sin to do, there's no requirement. The same thing for church leadership. Honor your leaders, respect and obey them. But if they're in sin, if there's something going on, then that must be rejected. That must be dealt with. It's the same thing with the government in the same way too. And so these are things that I wanted to point out. I think it's important to recognize because we do need to regain, I think, a healthy view of what it means to be a member, what it means to be part of church leadership. That for the elder, you need to recognize that you're accountable before God for the entire, the health of the congregation. But the congregation should recognize that it's a weighty thing to be led and to let them. We live in this kind of democratization of the whole process, right? I want to say in everything that happens, but that's not really the biblical view. You get to block and say whatever you want to say. Like, no, God has placed leadership so that it would be done this way. It's not the same as the government that we have and how we are structured. But that authority is not absolute. We want to pray for our leaders. We want to support leaders, but we also must always be connected to the Word of God, so much so that we are able to spot false teaching. We're able to spot sin if it rears its head. We're able to stand firm when it comes that in any of those areas of authority, any of those areas are transgressed. Right? So that's all I want to talk about today is, that there's a little bit more to it than what was able to be said during the past week as we went through Titus. But I hope that's helpful to kind of chew on, to think a little bit more. And I think that's it. That's all I got. So hopefully next week I'll be doing something with the Dr. Andrew Marquez, something from OTXNT. But today, it's what you got. You got me. All right. Talk to you guys later. Thanks for listening. Take care. Bye-bye.